Brownie, you're muted, but you're good to go. We're live.
Hey, I'll call this meeting to order of the Affordable Housing Subcommittee of the County Commission. Thanks everyone for joining us. And we're going to be addressing the recommendations on investment of home funds at this meeting and talking about our meeting schedule coming up, as well as the continuation of our discussion about the Affordable Housing Services Program from our last meeting. So do we have minutes to approve from the last meeting? It doesn't look like that. I don't see that on the agenda.
We did not include the minutes due to the time constraints in between, just to verify everything and finalize those. We'll bring those minutes and these to the next meeting.
Okay, no problem, no problem. All right, Matt, let's go ahead and move to new business and start off with the home allocations.
Okay, so the FY 2021 home allocations, the City of Asheville City Council will consider these formally at its July 14th meeting. For the home allocations, there were just over $1.2 million in funding available. There were over $4.3 million in requests. So similar to our programs, there's a limited amount of funding and often more requests than can be funded. Within that funding allocation, after the Asheville Regional Housing Consortium met and made its recommendations, and that will be what's brought forward to the City Council, a total of $367,213, or about 30% of the funding, is recommended for projects that are within Buncombe County. This table, and I know it's probably even harder to see on the small screens you're looking at wherever you are, you can see what those projects are. So the significant project is a project known as the Villas at Swannanoa. It's an 80-unit development by WDT Development. That applicant requested $330,000, was actually awarded through the allocations recommendation $330,000 for this $10 million project. The project is a low-income housing tax credit project, so it'll be out there competing for those funds as well. And the project has actually been going through the permitting process with the county, so we've seen it from the planning department side as well. It's targeted at seniors, so it's a senior housing project. You can see that there were two other low-income housing tax credit projects, not within Buncombe County, but a workforce homestead project known as Falling Waters, which is in Transylvania, and then a WDT development project known as White Pine Villas, which is in Transylvania. So those will be out there competing for that same low-income housing tax credit funding source. It's unlikely that all three will get funding, but it's possible that a Buncombe County project and one of the others might receive funding as well. That remains to be seen. The other items which are in that bright blue represent the remaining balance of funds that are awarded to agencies that are going to work within Buncombe County. And those are tenant-based rental assistance programs from Homeward Bound, the Housing Authority, as well. Some are targeted at Buncombe County specifically, some are targeted at Asheville, but we include those as being a Buncombe project. In all cases, their request exceeded what was awarded, but the consortium recognizes that it's unlikely that all three low-income housing tax credit projects will receive funding, so they may be able to reallocate some of that unused funding in this particular round to fully fund those tenant-based rental assistance programs. On those as well, all of the parties that were requesting the funding were on the line during that consortium meeting and discussed what they needed to be able to get through kind of that initial first quarter or two quarters to ensure that the funding levels would be able to support that need until potential reallocation could occur. So there were projects that did not receive allocation, and they're reflected at the bottom of the table. And those were based on a number of staff recommendations, ongoing discussion, their experience in terms of accessing the funds, and also whether they were trying to leverage other project funds, for example, low-income housing tax credit funding. So those are the current allocations. As I mentioned, they will go forward to the city council July 14th. They'll consider those and then actually make that authorization and approval. We should know about the low-income housing tax credit projects later in the year, August, September timeframe. We should be able to report back on that. Typically, this is a little different, and so we'll evaluate how the committee wants to recommend utilizing those funds and how the board wants to allocate those funds. But in our fiscal year, we allocate $75,000 for home match, and typically we apply that to a project that hasn't been fully funded. And so right now, and a construction project, I should say, that hasn't been fully funded. And right now, the requested amount of funding was fully provided through the consortium allocation. So we can evaluate how the committee wishes to use that match, be it to apply it towards some of that tenant-based rental assistance programs or otherwise. But that will be determined, I think, once we know more about the low-income housing tax credit awards. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have any about these projects. We can certainly get all the committee members copies of those applications. I do anticipate anything that happens in terms of, this project, the Villas at Swannanoa, I would anticipate they'll also be requesting Affordable Housing Services Program funds. So we'll likely see that coming through our own funding avenues.
Matt, the Volunteers of America projects, Laurelwood, Wood 1 and 2, are those in Buncombe County or a different county?
So they are, and those projects, part of why that funding didn't move forward or wasn't supported at this point is they're actually looking at collapsing those two different phases into a single phase and restructuring that project. So they kind of submitted their application and then they were going to make a lot of adjustments and revisions to that particular project.
Where is that at, Matt?
I honestly don't recall right offhand. And if I try to click there, I think I'm just going to create confusion. I don't remember its exact location right off the top of my head.
So it's a tax credit project as well.
That's my understanding, yes.
And the Villas at Swannanoa, you anticipate that if that project is awarded tax credit allocation, they'll come back and ask for more money from the county?
So and all applicants definitely will pursue all avenues, but I would expect that because our process is different from the home allocation, from low-income housing tax credit, that they may seek a loan product or other a construction loan product from us, given that the interest rates, are competitive and better than market. So it's possible that they'll look for that support from the county as well through that avenue.
Okay.
I don't have a firm, tentative request or any idea of what kind of funding they'll be looking for exactly.
And the Volunteers for America, that tax credit project, is it also going to be submitted to the state process this year? Do we know?
I don't believe so. Like I said, I think that project has been pulled back because they're looking at restructuring the phasing, particularly possibly the construction, general layout and design. I think it was, they were interested in the funding and then needed to make some modifications to that. That was my understanding through the consortium discussion.
So the Villas at Swannanoa is the only Buncombe County 9% tax credit project we expect to go to the state this year.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. Any other information from the staff we need to know before we deliberate or give a nod to these recommendations?
Really, there isn't any additional information that I can provide other than, once we actually see what the city council, how that vote occurs in July, then we can provide that information.
Okay. Joe, Amanda, do y'all have any questions? Joe, I think you're on mute.
So I'm looking away, but I'm looking at the bigger screen just so y'all know that's why I'm not looking at the camera. But no, I'm okay.
Okay.
I'm good.
You too, no questions. Thanks for the explanation, Matt.
Sure.
And the Homeward Bound project, could you go back for 1 sec? The Homeward Bound project, that's a scattered site project for homeless individuals, right?
Right. So they're looking at trying to identify small parcels to do small apartment type dwellings, small infill development projects. So I anticipate that, and in that particular structure, it looks like they would be rental, but largely subsidized rental. And so I anticipate, based on some communications we've had with Homeward Bound, that they will be looking possibly to apply for some construction loan funding, not as a grant, but through loan funding, because it would have some revenue generation, is my understanding, but for that type of project. They're also interested, and I don't want to speak on their behalf, until we see how applications come in. They're also interested in, if they're, county-owned properties, that would be infill properties that they could perform that kind of work on as well. So it's not just looking for funding, it's looking for sites. Kind of the same situation we find Asheville Buncombe Land Trust. They're looking for funding as well as for properties that they could use for that project. So,
is Homeward Bound or anyone else still, working on the idea, like, I guess it was, I don't know, 9 months ago, however long it was, the idea of like the Asheville Buncombe House project, more significant size project focused on hardest to house. I know there were issues with property that had been identified for that project at that time. Is that a project that they're still working on, or is anyone working on?
So we, and I say we, Nate and I actually met virtually with Homeward Bound staff just to talk about kind of where they are in projects. There is a focus on the scattered site project type, and that was a lot of what we were, discussing in that staff meeting. But I haven't heard about, I haven't heard that they're pulling away from that. I know, like you said, they had some site issues, so they're looking for other sites. I don't know that that project isn't moving forward, but it's not one that we've discussed with them probably since last fall, really. I can certainly reach out to them for an update on where that project is, though, and see what their intentions are, or how they anticipate that one advancing.
Apparently, that's not the project that was out on Lester Highway, is it? That you're talking about?
Yeah, that's right. It was the city had a piece of property out there, but it ended up having geotechnical problems that were identified. So I guess I would just to me it seemed like a very compelling project. I mean, for a lot of reasons in terms of obviously the goal of ending chronic homelessness, also just the vast resources that are consumed by healthcare, public safety. We're spending so much money managing that already that, and I know some of these smaller projects can probably help with some of those same folks that would benefit from a larger project like that. But anyway, that's the reason I'm asking, is it seems like such a project is just greatly needed in the community.
Yeah, that was a couple of years ago, I recall, and everybody was, the whole board supported it, from what I remember. And Evelyn was involved in it, is that right? That's the one you're talking about.
Homeward Bound was working on it. I don't remember.
I think there was several partners. Yeah, but
it might have been. I don't recall.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Any other comments on the proposal? Is there a recommendation? Is there a motion to approve these recommendations?
Yeah, I'll move approval.
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Although, I'm sorry, before we did that, we're going to take public comment at the end of the meeting, or Matt, could you refresh our memory on how we're handling public comment at this meeting?
Yes, so we allowed public comment prior to today, so we took comment until 5 o'clock yesterday. We did have one, but we'll read that out at the end of the meeting, as well as then take public comment through the Q&A
Brown?
portal.
Matt, was that, is it related to what we just voted on? The comment we got?
No, it was not.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just want to make sure. Same question that it was on this. All right, that sounds good.
Is there any way though, I mean, I know we've already approved, have a motion and a second, but without Homeward Bound being in the room with us, is there any way to have those questions answered prior to public comment, or do we need to wait?
We, Nate, so Nate has the ability to see participants that I may not, and he could see if Homeward Bound has indicated anything through Q&A at this point already.
And this is Nate, everyone. I'm currently monitoring Q&A. I also sent out a public announcement for a call for public comments, so I'll be monitoring that throughout. And I will check on our participants in the lobby and see who's with us.
Thanks, Nate.
And just, so we did actually send out, for all of our meetings, I send out notices to the agencies with which we regularly partner and anyone who's requested that. So Homeward Bound staff did receive notice of the meeting so that they could attend virtually, directly, in addition to our public notices.
Thanks. I just thought if there was somebody on, they may be able to go ahead and answer that prior to public comment. Thank y'all.
Okay, Matt, what's next?
All right. So next we'll jump into kind of our ongoing discussion. We got some feedback from the committee at our last meeting related to the upcoming 2020 Affordable Housing Services Program. And we're still at this point, I think it warranted additional discussion with the committee about the program description, requirements, and guidelines. And if we can flesh out those discussions, those directly impact the application budget forms that we'll need to prepare. But those are more technical and just executing out the program. So today, the next item we will discuss are those program description requirements and guidelines. And if you'll remember last time, I pulled up the actual document, but I thought what would be helpful is to kind of go through where we had landed or some of the issues that we were still generally discussing that seemed to be, an area of change or something new. So these are the areas where I think that some continued discussion may have been warranted. And it's looking at largely at the assistance level. So there was some discussion around that and also our loan terms. So the first item is down payment assistance loans. So this didn't really have any change. We're still looking at providing those loans at $20,000 per unit. One of the things that would be different in the next coming years, that would actually be our largest amount of funding available if the other changes are instituted. So that's something to keep in mind and part of why it's listed here. Tenant-based rental assistance, we're looking again at a $1,500 per unit cap. We have not had anyone come up to that level, and just for your reference, looking at the requests for home funding, all of those fell under that cap as well. So tenant-based rental assistance providers kind of adhere to or fall under that level of threshold. So there was no change. We didn't receive any kind of feedback on that particular program saying that that was insufficient. So that one is not really an ongoing issue, but again, bringing it up so that you can see that threshold level. Emergency repair, again, $10,000 to $15,000 per unit. We were not proposing a change to that particular program. The next couple of programs were areas where we had discussion about how we would fund those. The construction grant program with a $10,000 per unit cap. That would be a new program that's grant funding. We probably want to keep that construction grant program threshold in line with whatever you're going to do with your construction loan program. That was some of the discussion last time, so that one's there so that we can continue that discussion. The New Start program, again, this was a $10,000 maximum, trying to keep that consistent with what other thresholds and maximums were. There was discussion, and I didn't receive any feedback from partners that that was an insufficient amount of funding, but largely the committee may want to consider possibly increasing that level of funding as well for a new start. As we talked about, to support a position, that wouldn't be enough to support a position fully. It might support the start of a program in some capacity, but may not be sufficient enough for our initial start with that particular program. Construction for sale and for rent. So this had been at a $25,000 cap per unit. Based on the preference surveys, we have reduced that to $10,000 per unit. This may warrant additional discussion whether we want to consider increasing that back. I have received some feedback from our partners that that amount isn't necessarily sufficient to continue or would not be sufficient enough to support the projects that they would anticipate needing support for. Historically, we've had most of our projects under that threshold. There have been others, including the recent Old Haywood project, which is now known as New Heights. That one actually exceeded that level of investment per unit. So that's something that the committee may want to consider not changing or changing in a different way. Units for sale loans. So this was an area where we made a modification to increase the interest rate from 2% to 2.5%. And then units for rent loans. That had previously been a 15-year 2% loan. And we had looked at the schedule, which we can certainly talk more in detail about in a minute, having variable lengths, percents, and repayments, based on that structure. I will say we have received some public input on that particular one since the issuance of this particular packet of information, and it may be worthwhile discussing creating another category specifically for projects that are using low-income housing tax credit funding. And we may also need to address in some of the suggested requirements. Previously, we had added not allowing entities who are receiving that multifamily loan to, in that case, request tax reduction, property tax reductions. But there are some clauses that we might want to explore on low-income housing tax credit that may mean that those are exempt from that particular requirement, and we could add that language as well. So we need to address just a couple things based on feedback from our partners that do the low-income housing tax credit projects on loan structure, as well as some of the requirements for them in our contractual agreements. So that's kind of where we are in terms of needing to clarify and make some decisions, particularly around the funding level that the committee is interested in providing, and those loan terms. I think those are kind of the big outlying issues that we still hadn't really resolved. One of the things that I will say about the amount of investment per unit is it does significantly modify how many units you can impact for every dollar that you allocate. So if you were to take next year's budgeted allocation of roughly 1.8 million and apply that full amount, which isn't typical, but to say, well, we're going to be able to invest $25,000 per unit in loans, you could produce 72 units. That's not doing any of our other programs. So for every dollar, above 10,000 you go, you're reducing the number of units you can impact. But arguably at the same time, if the entities are having difficulty making that funding gap work because their amount per unit is too low, then we're not going to get units produced either. So it's kind of determining that balancing act, and it may be appropriate to not make a reduction at this point, but like I said, it warranted further discussion among the committee on that particular front. So with that, do you want to talk about a particular program level first, or talk about loan terms?
And again, Matt, when do you want to take this to the county commission?
So we would like to get something through committee and to the commission. So if we meet again in July, hopefully we could then turn around and get this to the the commission in early August so that we can then issue the call and try to get that money moving again by October.
Okay. And did you say that some of the public comments were on this item, right?
So the one comment we had received was related to this particular item, and it was a low-income housing tax credit builder. They just had comments about some of the restrictions on how that funding works, and looking at possibly establishing some different criteria for them in terms of loan terms. Through the prioritization process that the committee did, construction loans for multifamily developments with low-income housing tax credit are the second highest priority. So I feel like making some adjustments possibly in the loan schedule, specifically for projects that have been awarded those tax credits, would potentially be warranted and would show that kind of support in making those projects work more effectively. So from the staff's perspective, we got that comment. We received some of that feedback. We'll have to, look at the regulatory and other implications, but we can certainly bring back a table with, another category. This is the table from the existing draft, but adding another category that would show the interest rate and terms for low-income housing tax credit supported project. So we can work with the partners that we have before, MHO, Jimmy Amin, others that have done that work with in developing terms that would make sense to both those projects advancing and to the county as well.
All right. Joe, Amanda, do y'all have any questions or comments right now?
So the public comment that you got, was that for extended terms? Is that what
they were looking, I think, for more favorable terms for low-income housing tax credit projects. In those, the issue becomes how they structure all of their financing after the fact. The committee received some comments through the award of funding last year to a low-income housing tax credit project that our terms really were not flexible enough. We have for a long number of years had that 15-year maximum term, 2% flat interest rate. So in those cases, they're generally looking for a longer period of time for repayment in order to make those projects work, which we have, indicated in this revised program draft that we could extend that time frame, but that those interest rates might be a little higher for a longer period of time if that's the requested amount of funding. But it may be that, if the interest is really in supporting those projects, that we may need to have a 20-year term for a low-income housing tax credit project discounted more than a project without that funding or something like that. And those are the areas where I think we can work to come up with a different schedule. We certainly want there to be some justification there too. And that's why I think that, it would involve some additional staff time based on that feedback to make sure that that there's a reason that particular project type would need that.
Yeah, so I guess I'll share a couple of comments. My general understanding from the the retreat that we had and discussions with different people in this arena, the 4% tax credit program, could be a source of a lot of new units being developed in the region, but it's financially a much tougher model to make work, which is why we don't see it as much as the 9% project. So it seems like, in particular, if we do want to try to encourage that, that the terms for those loans might need to be more favorable than for the 9%, right? Where the 9%, they're getting millions of dollars of, additional equity from those more generous tax credits. So I could see kind of a differentiation there. Maybe we need to go longer or just have a lower interest rate for the 4% to at least kind of send the signal that, hey, this is something we're interested in. We've got a better, more generous, way of helping to support those. There might need to be other things that are done too, but that's one distinction that seems like it might be worth thinking about. The one other comment I had is that for new construction, for projects that are going to generate very little revenue, like again, kind of going back to like the Homeward Bound type project, where they're not going to be, maybe there's a little bit of rent, but not much, not like a regular rental apartment development. I wonder if the $10,000 cap is too low. So just again, like thinking about that project we were looking at in concept a year ago or so, you think it was like 60 units. If we had a $10,000 cap on that, then the maximum amount of funding they could get for a project like that would be $600,000, which is certainly not nothing. But for projects that really require a lot more public support, I'm wondering if that might be limiting. Of course, they could be drawing on other sources of funding as well, like home consortium, things like that. Maybe the theory is that this will be the only funding they get. So, but those are I guess my two comments.
This is Matt again. So one of the areas that, from a staff perspective, we could look at perhaps increasing, or in this case, leaving the cap for construction for sale and rent and construction grant program at $25,000 per unit. As I said, we don't have on record any project that's used that full amount, but they have used more than 10,000, at least in a recent project. Typically, they are less than 10, but we could increase that, and then through our project priorities narrative, explain that projects that use less than the max, or as a relative percent of the project cost, is lower or preferred over whether it's higher. So at one point we can say this is certainly available to the project, but at the same time we could say a project that's 50 units using $10,000 is preferred over 50 units that uses 25,000 or something to that effect. Does that make sense? Would that be something that would, I think, hit both of those targets?
I'm open to that idea. That makes sense to me. Although I guess the other specific comment was on the like the business terms of the loans, not the amount per unit. Although I do think an absolute cap of 10,000 per unit is too low. So I think that's raising that makes sense. But as you said, with preference given towards projects that keep it as low as possible, all things considered. But then also just the like the interest rate, for a 4% tax credit, just getting a 20-year loan at 3 or 4%, is that going to be financially viable? I mean, I think by itself, I think it's from what we've heard from folks, the answer would be no. So I'd be open to, particularly for these projects that objectively need more funding, more public support, maybe a more favorable interest rate for those projects, but maybe keep it the same or similar for 9% projects or other kind of projects. But yeah.
So Brownie, I would be more interested in giving the rate reduction. And I wouldn't mind a substantial rate reduction as opposed to, pushing that term way out. Just make it very attractive on the rate. Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, part of it is, some of the people in the development community have pointed out that they're getting long-term loans from other lenders in the projects. So, if ours is short-term, that can kind of mess up the pro forma in that, if it only goes out 5 or 10 years, then, the financial model kind of stops working when our loan expires. So I personally am pretty open to doing longer-term, loans. That's it seems like it adds a lot of value to what we're offering for these projects to go longer.
Have we done 30-year on anything in the past?
So our maximum loan term has been 15 through the Affordable Housing Services Program with that 2% interest. So everything has just been a fixed amount, both in time and rate previously. Now, through some of the special acts, loan terms have been provided for longer repayment periods. So Eagle Market, East Haven, some of those projects have a longer repayment period. But through the actual Affordable Housing Services Program directly, it's always been 15 years, 2% max.
I don't think I've seen that over 20.
Yeah, and I wasn't proposing like going to 30, but I think like it might make a lot of sense to have like a 20-year pretty favorable loan option.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think we entertain anymore. I remember sitting listening to one of the someone that had a 40-year loan. If you remember that, they were trying to push the loan, which does nothing. There's no difference between a 30 and a 40 really as far as payments. But anyhow, I'm okay with that. Sounds good.
I'm okay with that as well. It sounds good.
I would, while we're talking about the loan terms, so we had initially suggested from the staff's perspective, units for sale, the loans would be for 5 years with a 2.5% interest. That reflected an increase from the, in terms of the interest rate from what the existing program has. That particular loan product actually aligns with your most preferred project priority, which is construction loans for multifamily developments with units for sale. And so based on that, I think we definitely want that threshold of interest rates to be appealing or lower perhaps than in other cases. So from a staff's perspective, I just wanted to gauge the committee's perception on one, either reverting back to the 2%, which is lower than the other rate terms that we proposed for our multifamily product, and possibly even looking at a slightly lower rate since that's considered the #1 priority project. Does the committee have any preference there or thoughts on that particular item?
I don't have strong feelings about 2.5 versus 2 on that.
I don't either.
Yeah.
Well, what if the committee is okay? What we'll do is just set that floor, because this is the fastest repaid loan type, and we were basing the scaling of the interest rates based on the years of repayment. We'll just ensure that that is either at the lowest standard loan rate or just below it, since it's the shortest repayment window. If in our next draft that we bring back to you in July. That makes sense.
That's good.
And then the New Start program. So with the adjustments, we're looking at construction programs having that $25,000 cap. At this point, that $10,000 threshold was based on kind of those maximums from our other programs in that initial drafting, looking at that $10,000 max for construction. Would the committee be comfortable if we increase that to $25,000 for a New Start as the maximum? Given that we have the language that says, we're looking for project delivery and not necessarily for program administration support, and that the projects with a lot of administrative support are less preferred, would you be comfortable with allowing that to be the maximum and then weighing out those projects as they're received?
Yes.
So we can make that adjustment unless there's an opposition to that one.
I'm okay with it as long as we keep the concept that if there are, other projects that all things being considered are, very similar, the ones that are seeking lower amounts of funding are prioritized, right? With the idea of stretching our dollars as far as it can go. So I'm okay with a theoretically higher cap, but some way of incentivizing folks to, projects that need less.
Okay.
So can we make sure that language is in the, is in this somewhere?
Yeah, so we will add some language to the project priorities section that clearly states that New Start projects that require less funding are preferred over projects that require more funding. In addition to that clause about where it's program delivery versus administration, projects that would do more program delivery are favorable over purely administrative support projects. So we can add that language as well.
I think I spoke on this at our last meeting. I just want to make sure that the amount that is available for the program delivery is meaningful enough for the organization to justify writing the grant and not really just a token that help gets them through and they're having to piece together, 6 or 7 different funding sources. But I agree with all the above.
And Amanda, just thinking about it from a staff perspective, I mean, typically, in my experiences with grant funding, if you're using that for program support, it's about $23,000 to $30,000 for a part-time staff person if you're just budgeting for that. So I feel like that puts them at a threshold where you can support potentially a portion of a position or a position for a certain year to get a program up and running or something like that. So I do feel like that there's some opportunity there by increasing that maximum level for different project types to come through.
Great, that sounds fantastic. Thank you.
And so really the other discussion that I think we do need to have is just, I think there was some concern from the committee surrounding the interest rates and terms of the loans and about, how much money or revenue is generated from these interest rates compared to how much we might yield through our normal channels for generating revenue if we just held the funds. And there's been discussion with finance, and Don can certainly jump in and assist with that. Finance did help us in developing this initial schedule. So we already know based on feedback today that we're going to try to come up with a third category, which deals with low-income housing tax credit, and possibly a fourth category where we split 4% to 9%, so that those are even more favorable terms in terms of interest rates and the repayment periods to encourage those projects. But Don, I believe, is still on the call with us, and he can kind of speak to how those were set up, or if the committee wants to discuss that further and decide what's the point where we want that to be equivalent or not. There are some issues about how we can invest funds and the time over which those funds can be invested that impacted that rate discussion. And like I said, Don can speak to that, or if the committee wants to discuss this kind of the existing rates, and then staff can certainly answer questions about how we arrived at these to begin with.
Yeah, I'm happy to add a little background to this. Setting the rates, we went out and we looked at what you could get in the market, and then we came back and set the rates about 50 basis points lower than what anybody could go out in the market. Looking at what we can invest our funds in, we're limited by statute, we're limited by our investment policy, so we really can't go out beyond 5 years. And so it's not really a good comparison to say we're only going to be able to earn a small percentage on an investment. Why are we charging more for these longer-term loans? I look at it that these are similar to an investment, but they're a longer-term investment. They have more risk, so therefore you should get more return on your risk. We're happy to discuss the interest rates if the commission feels like they should be lower, more favorable. In my mind, these are in line with a good loan that you could go out if you're trying to do affordable housing, and getting a loan at Wells Fargo is beating their rates.
Yeah, but if, I mean, I guess to me, it's just kind of like a question of, can it work, right? I mean, can someone from the staff show me that a 4% tax credit project could work with these terms, or has, has worked somewhere similar, or I guess that's my question. Is just, I get the logic of that, but is it realistic?
And I think that that's always the interesting conversation that we have from the applicants is that phrasing of, well, we can't make the project work with that term. What we do know, is that we have been issuing loans at 15 years and 2%. So those are definitely a competitive loan out there. Otherwise, they wouldn't seek it from us. And we have been issuing loans for 5 years at 2%. So those rates are definitely competitive. I didn't receive.
Hey, can I ask a question then, Matt? Matt, can I ask a question on that point? But in those cases, aren't the developers getting additional public funding from other sources?
They are.
So I guess that's kind of why, and I'm not trying to, I think we need a consistent policy to follow, but it is part of what the staff would say when I asked the question about, is this realistic in terms of actually getting projects done, is that regardless of exactly where we land on these interest rates, for example, the underlying assumption is that for the vast majority of affordable housing developments, they will have to come and ask for the city and the county to give them additional funding of some amount that they'll come up with to bridge the gap between how these interest rates and this funding are insufficient to make a project financially viable. Is that the underlying assumption the staff work under?
I mean, our assumption is always that that these entities aren't going to be able to secure under a standard loan with a bank the financing that they need to perform the project. And so our target, our goal at the city and the county is to provide like a softer loan, a loan not at market rate, that then allows them to achieve a cost savings, which allows them to then secure a standard loan. So we're the piece that allows for them to secure the standard loan.
I know, but I'm not talking about the standard commercial loan. I'm talking about other taxpayer money to subsidize the project. Is it your assumption that if we adopt this interest rate schedule, that the vast majority of projects will not be viable if all they're getting is a loan from the county on these terms and a commercial loan? They're going to need some other public subsidy, and they're going to come asking for us to write a check to make up the difference.
In terms of not through this program?
Yeah, so it'll be like Home Consortium or some other source of like our limited pool of public funding. They'll need something else to make a project work in the vast majority of cases.
Right, and part of that's just the limit of funding available. So they're using, on any given project, they may have a low-income housing tax credit source of funding. They may have a North Carolina Housing Financing Agency loan. They may have a private loan. They may have city home consortium funds. They may have city funding, and they may have this loan through the housing services programs. They may utilize all the programs to make that a viable project. So we always kind of assume that there will be other both private and public funds in pretty much every project that we, through this program, are investing in.
So you're expecting them to come back? Awesome. They could come back. If to Brownie's point, if they don't get enough money, they'll come back. Now, or if they need additional money, they'll come back. Brownie, what's your thoughts on the rate? I mean, you just think that?
Well, I guess, this is a helpful conversation, and maybe because, I think that, the past experiences that have kind of been frustrating sometimes is like we approve funding for something, we think the project can go ahead, and then, and then it's like, well, no, we need more subsidy than that, or we need a different pool of subsidy. I mean, in the ideal world, it'd be like we have some kind of financial product, which is, consistent and it's there. And if people have good projects and they access the product, then they could have good projects move forward. But it sounds like they're always going to have to pull together other sources of funding too. In which case, I mean, maybe in some ways I'm not as worried about exactly where we land on this because I guess I'm resigning myself or feeling myself becoming resigned to the fact that they're still going to come ask us for more money than this.
Yeah.
So we don't need to stress out too much about exactly where these interest rates are because they're going to ask for, for grants and other stuff too.
I mean, unless you make this attractive enough up front and have a policy that says they can't come back, then, I mean, you can do that too.
Well, that was kind of Joe, that's kind of exactly what I was thinking. It's like, let's come up with something that actually is financially viable and it's out there and then people can use it, but then it's like, don't come ask us for more. This is the product that we have. But
I think if you did that, I think if you did that, you would want to have that as a policy and we would not want to, it'd be tough not moving from it. Somebody comes in but I think if you did it, you'd want to establish a policy where, we're going to do our best to, help you at the beginning, and you're going to have to go and get these other sources and you can't come back because we're going to give you a 2% loan for 15 years or whatever, or 20, whatever it is, wherever we land on it. But I don't think you could ever make this, I don't think you could ever get the rate low enough without a policy that would keep them from coming back. If they think they can get additional funds, they're going to come back.
One of and I'm just going to go ahead and throw this out.
That's okay.
I think this is an important point of discussion that's related to how these projects really function. And the projects that typically present the issue of coming back for more funding are the low-income housing tax credit projects. And part of that's because of the nature of their approval processes and the time frames from when they submit the applications to when they get awards. The fact that in some cases it's arguably structured such that the applicants actually under present the cost so that in that initial application they're more competitive because they're out there fighting for the dollar and then they realize the actual cost 2 years later when they get to that point. And so then there's that shortfall of kind of how they initially envisioned the project and what the project ends up being. That's not always the case, but that sometimes has been viewed as the case. And so we have a project where funds have been awarded. Contract has not been fully executed yet from the 2020 funding. That project we already know is going to be asking for additional funding. So there are a couple ways that can be handled. One, they could say we're not able to use that allocation. We go back to the board with a budget amendment and roll that into the 2021 application and they seek it again. So there's nothing to prevent someone from applying in the current scenario, and that's something we can explore if that's interested of the committee. There's nothing that prevents someone from applying in fiscal year 2020, being awarded and saying, I can't really accept that because it doesn't make the project work anymore, and then applying for funding again in 2021 at the level they now need. So there is that consideration that they, and those projects often come back again for additional funding support. And how you want to handle that, whether those interest rates are favorable, if they don't actually request the right amount of funding in the beginning because they're not going to realize construction until later, and those costs change. I don't know how we capture that issue or correct that issue with our offering.
I mean, if we're wanting to be consistent and we've talked about doing, one of these a year or whatever the number is, Brownie, then, to me, we want to make the award for that year. And we don't want them coming back the next year or the year after and asking for money on the same project. I don't think so.
Right. Okay.
But it happens. That's right.
Okay. Well, we're not, we don't have to make every final decision today. This is again probably just further discussion on this. Now, what else do we need to discuss today? on this item?
So really with this item, I think we're in a good place from staff's perspective to bring back a good draft. And I think what we'll have to discuss and get the committee's approval on next time is really that interest rate, this table with some additions and with some adjustments. We'll bring back a couple of options for how we would proceed. And with that particular table, I would recommend that we run it by our recent entities that have received award. So, last year and the year prior, Habitat for Humanity, MHO, Jimmy Amin, and Kirk Booth, those were all our construction partners that received those awards, and just kind of get their perspective. And we can also reach out to Institute of Government, our partners there, and kind of get their feedback. We'll bring back different options we could look at, and then try to finalize that piece so we can move forward in getting that program out in August, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, I would definitely love to get feedback from the Institute of Government staff who were on the workshop with us around some of these questions.
I agree.
Absolutely. That'd be helpful.
And I think we're at a good point with kind of clarifying those caps on the programs themselves, and figuring out those other issues on the previous slide, to where this is really what remains, and getting that clarity on. And so we'll get their feedback. Like I said, we'll bring back at least one option that we all feel good about, or possibly a couple of different options, depending on what we learn through that process in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for everyone's input on this. And so we're to public comment now, Matt.
Actually, we have one item under our next steps, and then I have an announcement as well. So the item under next steps has to do with the July 7th Affordable Housing Committee meeting. The Board of Commissioners, so that meeting happens the same day as the regular board meeting, and they are not holding that meeting. Does the committee still want to meet on the 7th, or would you like to push that meeting back to the second Board of Commissioner meeting date in July?
I would say push it back, but I'm flexible.
Unless there's a real strong personal preference would be to do that the second the meeting later in July rather than earlier. But I could do it if there's a timing reason that's important. I could do it, but my preference would be to do it later.
My preference is later as well, unless there's something pressing that we need to address.
I mean, from Seth's perspective, that'll give us some additional time to work out those issues with the table. We can bring back to the committee then all of the items and just have that table as kind of the last piece to get approval on. So that will be ready to send that forward and also request that. So I think that time frame works well. I don't think there's anything that we would accomplish on the 7th that would actually accelerate moving the application forward at this point.
That's great.
Right, so we will move that then to the 21st, I want to say it is, and hold the meeting at that date. We'll send out a notice of special meeting and handle all of those things afterwards. I also wanted to make an announcement. So you've heard previously, obviously, that we had an open community development analyst position here at the county, and we have filled that position. Our new employee will start July 1, so a midweek start, but we need the support, so we're excited about that. So on July 1, Andrew Mayrone, who had been with the city of Asheville, will be coming to join us. He had served as their community development analyst, or one of their community development analysts, for about the last year and a half. And he brings with him a lot of experience. He has a real estate background and degree, has been working in affordable housing for a number of years, and also, is bringing with him his experiences from the city. So he has great working relationships with our existing partners. He's very familiar with most, if not all, of our projects in some way or another that we're working on. So we think he'll be a great addition to the team, and just wanted to share that with the committee, given that he'll be starting and will be attending our next committee meeting.
That's great.
Right.
Great update. All right.
So all that remains then is public comment. And I can read the notice that or the comment we received first when they looks to see what else we have received. And let me just grab that email that we received prior to the meeting today. So the public comment that we had received was from Jim Yamin. So in this particular comment, he indicated the following. Please consider mirroring North Carolina Housing Finance Agency Qualified Allocation Plan underwriting guidelines for the home loan product known as the Rental Production Program Loan. Of particular importance is the principle of partial amortization to allow for variable annual repayment amounts, pegged to maintain a 1.15% debt coverage ratio, with a balloon payment at the end of the 20-year term. This facilitates the participation of other subsidized debt sources, a consistent feature of almost every low-income housing tax credit development, allowing the county's funds to be significantly further leveraged. In addition, allow debt obligation to be treated as soft rather than hard payment, i.e. a cash flow loan. Payment is required to the extent that annual revenues and expenses calculated after each year's annual audit demonstrate that excess cash flow is available above the 1.15 DCR standard. This also further leverages the county's funds by allowing the conventional first mortgage lender to underwrite their loan to a higher loan amount. As an overall policy matter, de-emphasize loan terms that focus on maximizing and limiting repayment, and instead prioritize terms that promote maximum underwriting flexibility. Recognizing that low-income housing tax credit projects, while offering unparalleled leverage opportunities, at the same time involve complex, multi-layered financing source structures that rely on reasonable accommodation from public funding sources, entities that have the unique capacity to play such an essential role. Focus on the goal of delivering quality affordable housing in a manner that is as efficient and effective as possible. Finally, under the Construction and Conversion Loan Agreement section, the requirement that applicants not pursue property tax relief for the lifetime of the loan, where constructed for rent, should be deleted, at least insofar as it applies to low-income housing tax credit developments, since it runs counter to General Statute Section 105-277-16, effective in the 2009-2010 fiscal year, stating that low-income housing tax credit developments must be appraised, assessed, and taxed using the income approach as the method of valuation and must take rent restrictions that apply to the property into consideration in determining the income attributable to the property. And again, that was the public comment received from Mr. Jim Yamin. Nate, with that, if you have any other public comments.
Yes, this is Nate. Hello, everyone. I do have a few to work through here. Some are multiple questions, and I'm going to try to group them so we sort of stay on task here. The first comment I have is from Anna Zubskaya from the Asheville Buncombe Community Land Trust. She would like to encourage this committee to increase the $10,000 max for the New Start program. From a startup perspective, it is very difficult to create a program with only $10,000 funding, and it is equally difficult to piece together grants from various organizations to have enough funding for a new program. Next comment I have, it's a series of 4 comments from Greg Borum. The first one is the tenant-based rental assistance amount limit might not be adequate when we're facing a community-wide COVID-fueled housing crisis when we'll need stabilization funds. Second part, I still think the county should not put a cap on per unit construction loan. If the committee sees a need for deeper affordability or more than 1-bedroom units, it may cost more. I also would like to hear how the committee will use funds to support longer periods of affordability, ideally 20 years minimum, with any county funding and investments in new construction. Part 3, he encourages the committee to require developers to accept housing vouchers if utilizing county funding. And finally, part 4, on the issue of interest rates, can the county align its rate with City of Asheville Housing Trust Fund for consistency and simplicity for developers? And then as a final public comment, I did hear from Homeward Bound, and I actually had a phone call with their development manager, and I have also heard from Van Vogel. He is the chair of Homeward Bound, and I think he answers some of our earlier questions here, and I'll go ahead and read. Homeward Bound is pursuing the 80-unit Asheville Buncombe house as well as smaller scattered site development. We have identified 2 potential sites for the 8B house, but neither is under site control. We would like to review anticipated funding requests with staff in this committee, but do not anticipate needing full commission approval of a budget request before FY 21-22. We will be requesting substantially more from the county than the $10,000 per unit being discussed. We look forward to updating staff and committee as soon as this can be scheduled. And that concludes the comments that I have in the Q&A portal.
Thank you.
One announcement from our side, Brownie, just real quick. We will be switching to Zoom Enterprise. I think it's going to make it a lot more of a simpler platform. It's a paid professional version, so we will be making that change for future meetings.
Okay. Great. I think we've gotten through all of our agenda items, Matt, or is there anything else we need to address before we adjourn?
That is everything.
Okay. All right. Well, appreciate all the staff for all your work on this meeting in preparation and helping us out today, and all members of the public who are interested in these issues and keep giving us great input on these policy questions. So with that, I think we are adjourned, and I'll see you guys at our 3 o'clock meeting in a little while.
Okay. Thanks, guys.